I think I mentioned this last time, that thanks to Olivia, we have the videos for the last 3 lectures, and I guess it'll be available for this one and the last class next time, are on a YouTube website. And I asked Barbara to send out an email to the class so that you'd have the website address, though I don't imagine too many of you will actually want to go there, but tell your friends, I don't in case you can't wait for Barbara to send the message, if you're on YouTube, if you just did OLLI at Auburn, it's the page that has videotapes of other, I guess it's not really videotape, but recordings of other presentations for OLLI that have been done in the auditorium. So there are some other things there that you might be interested in. And then lastly, before I get to the lecture proper, a couple of people had asked me about reading that I might recommend about Ronald Reagan. So I brought a couple books I'll show and tell you the titles. There's one other that I have not actually read, but is more recent than what I've read that I'll mention also. But for those of you who really want to get into it, there's this. This is called President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime by the journalist Lou Cannon, C-A-N-N-O-N. It's old in the sense that it was published soon after he finished his term as president, so it came out in 1991. But it's still widely thought of as one of the best things written about him. So it has a full biographical treatment, but a lot of detail about his presidency. So that's one. And then, for those of you who want to read something else, but not that big, there's this little book. And this is part of the Library of American Biography series that has been around for many, many decades. So this is more recent. This, I think, came out in 2006. It's just called Ronald Reagan. It's by Jules Teigel. And his last name is spelled T-Y-G-I-E-L. So as you can see, it's about 200 pages. Well, it's a little bit more than that, like 250. But is a biography with a good deal of attention, obviously, to his presidency. Teigel, he's famous for having also written a really good biography of Jackie Robinson, which I highly recommend. And then the most recent biography of Reagan by a significant historian, I think it's actually called Reagan, but the author is H.W. Brands, B-R-A-N-D-S. So those are 3 possibilities for. Okay, and then what we're going to do today, what I'm going to do today, with your participation, if you have comments and questions, is talk about the second term, and it's almost exclusively the second term dealings with the Soviet Union and how there's such a dramatic change from the first term when people are talking about the Cold War being at its most intense since perhaps the 1950s, to by the end, when he left office in early 1989, people talking about the Cold War coming to an end. Now, usually people you can date the end of the Cold War with all kinds of events. Most often, people cite the coming down of the Berlin Wall in 1989, after Reagan had left office, although, of course, he was famous for calling upon Gorbachev to tear down this wall, speech he gave just a couple of years earlier. And of course, it wasn't Gorbachev who literally tore it down, but the East Germans. But clearly, even before he left office in January of 1989, there was just a dramatically different relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Though again, I don't think anybody, certainly I would not have predicted when I was teaching in 1989 that very soon there would actually not even be a Soviet Union, or that Germany would be reunited. I mean, there are all kinds of things that happened very soon after he left office, which I don't think anyone was really anticipating. Certainly I don't think the CIA thought that the Soviet Union was going to disappear if you'd asked them in 1988. So, one thing, and this gets to the whole question about whether Reagan's increase in military spending and focus on the Strategic Defense Initiative, whether those were the moving factors that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union or not. And I think it's important to look back even before Reagan became president at what was happening to the Soviet economy. In that even before the Soviets had to confront this substantial increase in military spending by the United States, the Soviet economy was already a basket case. Especially in the 70s, whereas earlier the Soviet economy had been growing very rapidly. By the end of the 70s, the time when Reagan took office, the Soviet Union was really stagnant in terms of its economic growth. And certainly one of the factors, long before the Reagan buildup, that, to supposedly put pressure on the Soviet Union, the Soviets were spending, before Reagan became president, the Soviets were spending about 25% of their GDP on their military. And it was not sustainable. It wasn't sustainable in terms of being able to provide consumer goods to the Soviet people or the Russian people. It wasn't sustainable in terms of having appropriate investment in new technologies that were not directly related to the military. So they were already in trouble. As a comparison, the United States, which spent far more on the military than Western European or other Western democracies, the United States was spending at this time about 6% of its GDP on the military compared to 25% for the Soviet Union. And of course, the US had a much, much larger gross domestic product than the Russians. So the US wasn't, in a literal sense, being outspent by the Russians, but it was a much smaller part of the economy. And so I was actually, I guess I knew this at one time, but when I was reviewing for this lecture, I was reminded of how bad things were actually in the Soviet Union in the 70s. Life expectancy in the Soviet Union in the 70s was actually going down. Not by many, many years, but whereas almost all the industrialized world was seeing life expectancies increasing, the Soviets, because of the unbalanced economy, the lack of investment in the kind of healthcare that other industrialized nations were able to provide, the Soviet Union actually saw a decrease in life expectancy, and this is again before Reagan took office. And in terms of what kind of economy the Soviets could compete with on a world scale, the only thing that the Soviets really had that anybody else in the world wanted was oil. I guess natural gas has also become a significant factor for the Soviet Union, but especially oil. And in the early 70s, right in the early 70s, actually starting in '67 with the Six-Day War in the Middle East, through the 1973 war in the Middle East, oil prices went up just very, very dramatically to the benefit of the Soviet Union. But after the '73-74 oil crisis and energy crisis, when oil prices came down from or at least stopped accelerating the way they had earlier, that was also another burden on the Soviet economy when the one thing they had to sell to the rest of the world was, if not losing value, it certainly wasn't gaining value. So all that is to say that in the context for what happened when Reagan became president, the Soviets were already in trouble. And I go over that because it's critical background to what Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to do in the Soviet Union when he became the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985. Gorbachev, clearly represented a new generation of leaders in the Soviet Union. He was, I think, 56 when he became general secretary, whereas, they've been dying off. The leadership had been dying off almost as fast as you could remember their names. Earlier in the 80s, they had, 3 different leaders in 3 years before Gorbachev assumed power in 1985. And Gorbachev represented a quite different perspective. He was really much better educated than the previous Soviet leaders who had been in positions of power and who had risen up through the party really as party bureaucrats. Gorbachev rose up through the party rapidly because he was a very capable person, but he was trained in the law. He had broader, exposure to basically a higher education that made him a somewhat more cosmopolitan figure than the previous leaders of the Soviet Union. But most importantly, as soon as Gorbachev became general secretary, he recognized what was going on in terms of the Soviet economy, and that change was going to be absolutely necessary inside the Soviet Union if the country basically wasn't going to collapse. And that change, he came to use a term for the change that he initially was focused on, and it was called perestroika, which basically meant the restructuring of the Soviet economy. Gorbachev was a communist. He wasn't thinking, I want to change the Soviet Union into a purely capitalist country, but he did recognize that the degree of state controls over the economy and also the focus on the military to the exclusion of almost everything else meant that they had to reorient things and open up a little bit more to market forces to create greater efficiencies within the economy. Again, he wasn't talking about, doing away with all state enterprises or having a purely free enterprise system, but he basically said we have to incorporate at least more influence of the market rather than having just purely political decisions about where our investment goes or how we're going to run things. So perestroika was his first objective, but then he sort of quickly learned after he assumed the reins of power in 1985 that restructuring along the lines he was thinking of would run into opposition from a lot of the old line communist bureaucrats in the country who may have seen the country doing poorly, but a lot of the bureaucrats in the Communist Party led perfectly comfortable lives, and they were concerned that restructuring and even transferring, funding from the military to other sectors, that there were interests within the Soviet Union that were serious obstacles to restructuring the economy. And he then introduced what came to be the second major term that's associated with the reforms that Gorbachev tried to implement in the Soviet Union. And this came to be known as glasnost, which basically I think is translated as openness. And what he basically said is that, both in terms of the running of industries, the running of the economy, where information had been guarded, very secretively in the old system, basically said if we're going to try and have a more efficient system, we have to be able to allow people to offer both suggestions for improvement, but also criticism of people who are preventing reforms from being implemented. And this also is going to have to apply more or less to a somewhat more liberalized political system. Still, in 1985, 86, he wasn't talking about doing away with the Communist Party's monopoly of power in the Soviet Union, but he's basically saying, if we're going to try and restructure everything, we need to have more open discussion about how we're going to do this, and challenge some of the prerogatives of some of the long-term bureaucrats within the Soviet system. So he definitely was for liberalization. He wasn't, in the very first stages, he wasn't saying let's have a purely democratic, pre-enterprise system, but he did want to introduce a greater degree of democratization within the Communist Party so that the kind of the ruling elites within the party, could be cast aside and different points of view might come to the forefront if there was a greater possibility for open choice. But all of this, whoops, I'll go back to here for just 1 second. But all of his desire for change, and especially restructuring, I can't emphasize enough how he very early on came to the conclusion, and I think this was, it wasn't undermined by what Reagan was doing, but it wasn't just Reagan, it was the long view of what kind of changes needed to be made, that arms control and limiting spending on the military and limiting spending especially, not only, but especially on nuclear armaments, that was going to be an important component of being able to revive the economy. So he was, from the early on, he was very interested in pursuing some sort of arms control agreements with the United States. And if you remember, there had been it's not like he would have been brand new in that regard. I've mentioned these before, that under Richard Nixon, there'd been the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, there'd been the SALT I treaty that Nixon had negotiated that put a ceiling, didn't reduce armaments, but it put a ceiling on the number of weapon systems which each side could deploy. And then under Carter, there'd been another arms agreement, SALT II, which even though it wasn't ratified by the US Senate, which put further, it reduced further the ceilings on delivery systems of weapons. SALT II wasn't formally ratified, but interestingly enough, in spite of all the rhetoric of Reagan when he became president, criticizing the Soviet Union and wanting an arms buildup, Reagan actually honored the unratified SALT II agreement. He didn't try to exceed the limits that were placed on the U.S. by the SALT II agreement or initially by the ABM Treaty. Sort of reminds me of Donald Trump and Iran so far in terms of being harshly critical, but so far not jettisoning the terms of an agreement that had been reached by a previous administration. Now, in terms of Gorbachev's desire to pursue, arms control agreements with the Reagan administration, there were a couple of obstacles that really preceded, whose recent history precedes Gorbachev becoming General Secretary, but which then were major obstacles to US-Soviet relations once Gorbachev did take over in 1985. And both of these go back to really 1983. I had talked, I guess it was last time, I talked about SDI and Reagan's understanding or perception of what Star Wars or the Strategic Defense Initiative could mean. I think Reagan was quite sincere in thinking that it's so much better if we could move toward a defensive system against nuclear war rather than depend on the notion of mutually assured destruction, that if somebody fires off a missile, then we just destroy the whole world. Not a great, in his view, that wasn't the best way to try to deal with the threat of nuclear weapons. He said, if we could develop literally a defensive system where we can shoot down missiles, wouldn't that be much better? And remember I said from the outset, he said if we could develop this, it would be so good and we could do away with the real threat of nuclear war, we'd share it with the Russians. so that, you know, they would also feel good about moving away from nuclear armament, the threat of nuclear war. SDI, as we'll see, especially when they had a very dramatic summit between Gorbachev and Reagan in 1986, SDI was a real obstacle to arms control because, first of all, the Soviets, before Gorbachev and Gorbachev II, did not really believe that if the United States could ever successfully develop an anti-missile defense system, that then they'd willingly just share it with the Russians. Rather, you know, the Russian military said if the US ever could develop such a system, then they can threaten us with nuclear war. They can say, we're going to nuke you, and we can defend ourselves. You can't, so you'll do what we want you to. And so the Soviet military in particular, and most nuclear theorists in the United States also, there were plenty saying that an anti-ballistic missile system would actually be destabilizing because it would be seen as a threat to the Soviet Union. And also, they said, well, we just developed in 1972 this anti-ballistic missile treaty where both sides agreed that we would very severely limit each other's development of an anti-ballistic missile system for exactly the reasons I've just stated. The fear on both sides that an ABM system would actually make the threat of nuclear war greater rather than lesser. Reagan never bought that. He either didn't understand it or he just rejected that. He just kept thinking, a defensive system, why is a defensive system threatening to anybody? So that would be a really big obstacle to making any kind of progress on arms control, at least for a while. And the other big issue that initially, and this was true when Gorbachev took over in 1985, is that the Russians had, for a number of years, had intermediate and short-range missiles stationed in Eastern Europe. These were not missiles that could have reached the United States, so they didn't threaten the United States. They were seen as part of the Warsaw Pact, the defense alliance that the Soviets had with its Eastern European client states, and they were thought of as a deterrent to any attack on, into the Warsaw Pact by NATO. Those had existed for a number of years. The United States, under Reagan in 1983, began talking about the United States then putting a really modern intermediate range missile into Western Europe that it wouldn't just threaten the Warsaw Pact, Eastern Europe, which could reach the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, and this goes back before Gorbachev and then after Gorbachev became General Secretary, the Soviets were vehemently opposed to the United States putting in a new generation of intermediate missiles into Europe, which they saw as a direct threat to them. In a way that the Russian missiles in Eastern Europe did not threaten directly the United States. Russians had plenty of intercontinental ballistic missiles housed in the Soviet Union, which could reach the United States, but these other missiles were not really a direct threat. So the Russians kept saying, we don't want these missiles which could reach Soviet territory more quickly than the intercontinental missiles, located in the United States or even on the submarines that are at sea carrying nuclear weapons. Reagan went ahead, and this was part of the hard line with the Soviets. Reagan went ahead in 1983 and approved the placement, they were called Pershing II missiles, in Western Europe, much to the annoyance, that's a weak word, of the Soviet leadership. And so that was also something that when Gorbachev became General Secretary, one of the objectives for him of arms control was to get those US missiles, intermediate range missiles in Western Europe, out of there. So when Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, soon thereafter, he and Reagan had a meeting, a summit meeting in Geneva, which I don't have listed on here. This was still in 1985. No concrete, specific agreement or agreements were reached at that summit meeting in Geneva soon after Gorbachev became president, but they began talking about arms control that would include not just the ceilings on how many more weapons each side could build, which had been the whole approach of the SALT I and SALT II, but now they were saying, let's start talking about reducing the number of nuclear missiles in each of our arsenals. They didn't come to any kind of definitive agreement about it, but they actually had what seemed to be somewhat productive discussions in Geneva. And they had agreed that they were going to have another conference that was going to take place later in 1986 or 1987 to try to pursue arms control agreements. But Gorbachev sent a sort of a quick invitation later in 1986 to Reagan and said, well, let's have a preliminary meeting, a preliminary summit to what we had talked about later as the big summit. And said, let's meet either in Reykjavik, far away, or London. And for some reason, Reagan preferred Reykjavik. I'm not quite sure. I don't know. We're actually going to go to Iceland next year. But they had a quickly scheduled meeting that Reagan went to totally unprepared. I mean, they didn't think, it wasn't just Reagan, but his advisors didn't necessarily think that this was going to be like a major discussion, thought it was another kind of preliminary to what was going to be a later conference to try to hammer out arms control. And they were pretty shocked when, at Reykjavik, when Reagan and Gorbachev met, Gorbachev brought out a whole list of specific proposals regarding arms control. And one of the key offers that was made to Reagan by Gorbachev had to do with those intermediate range missiles stationed in Europe. And Gorbachev said, well, the United States, after they put the Pershings in Europe, Reagan had talked about what was called a 0-0 option, where, well, we just put them in recently, but we'll take them out if you, Soviet Union, take out all your intermediate and short-range missiles stationed in Europe as well. So we'd have 0-0 in terms of intermediate range nuclear missiles stationed in Europe. That was what Reagan had proposed. Now Gorbachev is coming back at him and saying, yeah, we'll do that. And then he said, but why stop there? That's very limited. Each side had thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. And Gorbachev proposed, over a period of time, let's reduce our nuclear arsenals, our missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons, by 50% over a period of time. And again, this was something that they had talked somewhat about at Geneva, and it sounded pretty good, because it was somewhat in line with what at least Reagan himself and some of his more, people like George Shultz, who were interested really in pursuing arms control agreements with the Russians, favored. The hardliners in the Reagan administration, people like Caspar Weinberger, were not very enthused about discussions along these lines. They wanted, they didn't trust the Russians. They thought that if, we get into arms control with the Russians, it's going to weaken our ties to Western Europe, because the Western Europeans are going to wonder, well, would we actually defend them if the Russians came, with their tanks into Western Europe if we don't have a nuclear, umbrella over Western Europe? So the hardliners in the Reagan administration at Reykjavik who were there were really kind of horrified hearing some of the discussions that were going on directly between Reagan and Gorbachev. And then after that, they met several times. They had quite extended discussions in what was supposed to just be this, ad hoc preliminary meeting. And then Gorbachev tossed out the idea, well, we've been talking about a 50% reduction, but why don't we really seriously consider eliminating all nuclear capable missiles? And Reagan said, sounds good to me. That's not a direct quote, but it's close. And that was consistent with Reagan's horror about nuclear weapons. I mean, that was a genuine, here's Gorbachev talking about what had been an aspiration by Reagan. Even when Reagan was supporting SDI, he was thinking of it as something that would make nuclear weapons kind of irrelevant. And so when Gorbachev tossed out that idea, Reagan was pretty enthused. And again, Reagan's advisors, especially military people, the hardliners in the Pentagon, they were horrified. And it was also not exactly clear, and it wasn't, I don't think, clear in Reagan's mind, what kind of missiles are we talking about? Because they were using different terms. They were using nuclear missiles, they're using strategic missiles, and there are all kinds of missiles. They're short range, long range. They're what are called strategic weapons, which are basically ones that in an all-out war would be carried long distances, against the enemy state. Then there are battlefield nuclear weapons, which are much smaller. When he was talking about getting rid of ballistic missiles, he seemed to be talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles, whether land-based or the ones that were based on submarines, which were also had a very long range. But it wasn't actually exactly clear. And again, I think many experts thought that Reagan himself wasn't exactly clear what they were talking about. And it's not exactly clear. Gorbachev might have known what he was talking about, but the language was somewhat vague. So that idea was tossed out. But Reagan said, this sounds all great, get rid of nuclear missiles, but of course, I still want to develop SDI because it's a defensive system, it's not threatening to anybody, but it also will make any kind of future threat of nuclear weapons irrelevant. So yeah, let's agree to this other stuff, but I'm still going to want to keep working on SDI. And according to the ABM treaty, research in the laboratory was all right. The ABM treaty didn't prevent either side from engaging in research activities that were confined to the laboratory. But Reagan, of course, thought if we make progress in the laboratory, at some point, we then will actually want to start testing this stuff outside the laboratory. So he didn't want restriction on what kind of development could take place. He wanted to go beyond research to possibly allowing real-world development of such systems. And Gorbachev basically said, there's no way I'm going to agree to that as part of an overall nuclear arms agreement because I still, and the people back in Russia, especially the military, but Gorbachev himself said, you may be perfect. I don't think he ever put it this way, but I think what he was thinking, Reagan, you might be perfectly sincere in saying that if you ever developed such a system, you'd share it with the Soviet Union. But you think I, as the leader of the Soviet Union, could count on all future American leaders to adopt the same position so that at some future point, we may have been talking about eliminating nuclear weapons over a long period of time, but if in 10 years you develop an ABM system and you've still got some nuclear weapons left, you're going to be in a position to dictate terms to the Soviet Union, and I can't be a legitimate leader of my country and accept that. So after lots of reports, how many of you remember the Reykjavik? So a lot of this may be somewhat familiar. You know, there.
He fell asleep.
I don't think he fell asleep. He was pretty engaged in this. At the time, you know, while these reports were coming out in the news about major progress towards a huge arms control agreement, and then finally at the end they have to come out and say, you know, the talks broke down. We couldn't agree ultimately on anything, and so there was a degree of disappointment. But in a way, it is true that both Reagan and Gorbachev came away from Reykjavik thinking that we had come really close. You know, SDI was a stumbling block, but gee, you know, even about the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces in Europe, we actually had an agreement about that, but it was going to be part of a broader package, and then that fell apart. But we were really making progress, and we were making progress on the idea that both of us agreed to, that it would be a good idea to cut back on the actual number of nuclear weapons. So in some ways, even though that it had broken down with both Gorbachev and Reagan being pretty mad at each other for their failure to really close the deal, when they reflected upon it, they thought, well, we've come a lot closer in these discussions to the most substantial arms control agreement, basically in the nuclear age. So, there's the, that was actually taken in Reykjavik. And in fact, let's see, how are we doing on time? I don't know, should we take, this is early, but do you want to take a break now, or you want me to keep going for a little while? This, in terms of drama, this is a good place for for a break, because then we got the good stuff that, you know, where they actually do reach agreements and things get a whole lot better. So why don't we just take a 5-minute break now, and then I'll continue. Okay, I think that was a generous 5 minutes I gave you. So, as I indicated, you know, even though right when Reykjavik broke up, and there was, you know, widespread disappointment that they had come seemingly close and that SDI had proved a stumbling block, you know, nevertheless, Gorbachev was intent on pursuing arms, and it wasn't that Reagan wasn't, but the desire of both sides, for somewhat different reasons, to pursue arms control did produce a breakthrough the next year. And the breakthrough was premised on a decision by Gorbachev that he would be willing to separate out from the overall discussions that they had had at Reykjavik that was, you know, really kind of comprehensive arms control, to just focus on an area that they had agreed to, but was, you know, previously wrapped in a larger package, and that was to deal with the intermediate range nuclear forces stationed in Europe. And basically Gorbachev, he did make this concession. He said, I'll separate that out, and then we don't have to keep talking about SDI right about this. And in 1987, that is the primary Soviet concession by Gorbachev that made the INF Treaty possible, saying that we can isolate that agreement from anything else. But then the question was, what does INF stand for? Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. And in this case, those intermediate range, and actually it also did include shorter range missiles stationed in Europe by both sides. They basically agreed to eliminate all of those weapons. And in fact, by eliminate, not just withdraw them and then move them someplace else, the INF Treaty called for the destruction of those weapons, which would have to take place over a period of time, because actually it's not easy to destroy a nuclear weapon safely. So a fairly elaborate process was involved, which would have to take place over a period of years. But the agreement was to go to the 0-0 option. And you know, I'm sure you remember, you know, the phrase that Reagan made, you know, famous when he said, you know, trust but verify, which actually I think was actually a Russian phrase that he adopted. I don't know what the Russian words are, but he took it and put it back to Gorbachev, and they agreed that in the INF Treaty that they would have what's known as on-site verification, that as those nuclear weapons were withdrawn and then to be destroyed, that the Americans would actually have on-site observers to watch the Russians dismantle and destroy the nuclear weapons, and vice versa. So that there, you know, a lot of times in all the previous arms control agreements, conservative critics had always said, well, you can't trust the Russians, we can't, you know, rely strictly on satellites, and they had always said, you know, we really had to have on-site verification, which was not part of the SALT I or SALT II agreements. But in this breakthrough, this was included. And that meant, in terms of how significant a treaty this was, on the one hand, not so significant because intermediate range missiles constituted about 4% of all the nuclear missiles that both sides had. So it wasn't like getting rid of a huge class of weapons, but it was the first time there'd ever been an agreement about, in the nuclear age, to literally destroy, to get rid of, in a literal sense, any category of nuclear weapons. So in that sense, it moves far beyond the SALT I and SALT II treaties. And then, even in Reagan's last year in office in 1988, it wasn't only that they had the INF Treaty and started talking about coming back to that reduction, the 50% reduction, but SDI was still an obstacle to further arms control with Gorbachev while Reagan was president. So that was the only arms control agreement they reached, just looking ahead a bit, when George Herbert Walker Bush became president. By 1991, there was a START agreement, strategic arms reduction talk or treaty. There was in 1991 an actual treaty to reduce intercontinental ballistic missiles that both sides had. So there was, you know, build up, and then that, interesting carrying that forward. You know, that was a treaty with the Soviet Union, and you know what happened after 1991. There was no such country as the Soviet Union. And you know, the missiles that the Soviets had were actually housed in several of the constituent republics of what had been the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So that Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, I think there was one other that actually had nuclear weapons on its territory. So looking ahead, when they finally reached later agreements in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, they had to have a follow-up agreement where Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine all became signatories, along with now just Russia. And the other republics agreed to basically hand over their nuclear weapons to Russia so that it could be enforced for reductions. And we do have, you know, in today's world, there are a lot fewer nuclear weapons than there were back in the 1980s. Of course, they're more accurate, probably more powerful, but there are fewer of them.
What was that process about how many were eliminated?
Until today, you mean? Or you mean?
How long has that went on?
Well, it went on, there were several iterations. There was a START II treaty, which actually never fully went into effect because it was replaced by another treaty. And altogether, what is it now that each side has?
We have 4,000.
Yeah, we have 4,000, and we had over 10,000 when things started. Yeah, that would, the 32,000 would count the battlefield weapons as well. Yeah, so these treaties had to do with strategic missiles that were capable of going, you know, well beyond the battlefield. But so it's a very substantial reduction in the number.
My number is counting what is still maintained as far as bombs and tactical at 4,000. As far as delivery systems, I believe our delivery system for ICBMs is at 1,000.
Yeah.
I believe that's the accurate number for ICBMs.
And could you hear, so the number of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that the United States has currently is about 1,000. And that would include land-based, it also includes the submarines, and then that doesn't count the bombers that can also deliver nuclear weapons. Yeah. So, I mean, there has been a substantial reduction. Tom? Do the weapons have a shelf life? I believe they do. I mean, I believe, you know, I don't know the details about it, but yes, it's not like once you create it, then you just leave it and don't worry about it, you know, forever. Yes, they do need to be maintained. And also, one of the other agreements that was reached is that one of the things that this is an aside, but it's, you may or may not be interested, but you know, in the 70s, one of the big controversies with Nixon and the Russians when they were talking about arms control was the development of what are called multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, or MIRVs. You know, you think of a missile carrying a bomb, but in the early 1970s, the United States developed, before the Russians, and then the Russians followed suit, the US developed a system whereby one missile could carry up to about, I think it's 10 independently targeted nuclear weapons. So you'd have one missile that could deliver a weapon against Moscow as well as against, you know, Leningrad. Up to 10 different sites could be hit by one missile. Plus decoys. But one of the arms control agreements actually, it either eliminated altogether MIRVs or it put limits on MIRVs.
Put limits on, we still, I believe the Minuteman III that we still deploy is still free, still MIRV free warhead. What was the current name? The big one we never deployed was going to be a 10. The name escapes me, but we were going to put it on railroad tracks.
Oh, the MX.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the bottom line is that foundation for arms control was started on, you know, meaningful arms control that meant reduction as opposed to ceilings does have its origin in the Reagan administration. And we can be thankful that there are a lot fewer nuclear, you know, weapons in the world today than there were then. Now, but that wasn't the only, arms control was not the only basis of what clearly was beginning to be a very different relationship between the United States and when the Soviet Union still existed before '91. In fact, you know, when I show, I have a picture. I'm going to go back, but here, this is the picture of Reagan and Gorbachev signing the INF Treaty in Washington in 1987. And if you can remember, I mean, Gorbachev was extremely popular in the United States. And actually, even until today, you know, he maintains a, kind of a high reputation in the United States and in the West, much more so than back in Russia. But it was already clear that they were getting along in a way that certainly represented a whole new turn in the history of the Cold War. Even if the Soviet Union had continued to exist, it was a different relationship. And so, as I said, it wasn't only in arms control agreements that the Cold War seemed to be definitely winding down by the end of Reagan's presidency. And the Gorbachev, when he first came into power in 1985, he actually, he had supported, he supported the Russian war in Afghanistan to try to maintain the communist government in Afghanistan. As the Islamic-inspired insurgency against that government grew stronger, and especially after 1986, when the United States began providing the insurgents with Stinger missiles, they're short-range missiles but that could shoot down helicopters and low-flying airplanes, that the Russian effort more and more seemed to be like a quagmire without much hope of really being fully successful. And it was very, a lot of people, refer to Afghanistan as Russia's or the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It certainly became unpopular at home. I think the figures are that 15,000 Russians died in Afghanistan, and it was costly. They had over 100,000 troops stationed in Afghanistan during the war. And between the cost and the unpopularity of Russians coming home dead from Afghanistan, Gorbachev increasingly came to the conclusion that this was not worth the effort, and he made the decision that he would end the Russian involvement in Afghanistan in 1988. And so he withdrew just before Reagan really left office. And I don't actually have it up here, but also by 1989, and this is just after Reagan left office, the Soviets, who had been providing some arms assistance to the Sandinista government in Angola and had been supporting certain other movements around the world. I said Angola, the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua. I was thinking Angola next because there was also a civil war going on in Angola that the Russians and the United States were involved in on opposite sides. But in Nicaragua also, this is just after Reagan left office, Gorbachev basically agreed to stop providing arms because it was sort of part of that larger peace settlement that I talked about when I discussed the Iran-Contra situation. And then, this was really, extremely significant. And this was, again, after the election that brought Bush Sr. to the presidency, but it was, I think the announcement may have come in December of '88, or it was certainly in early 1989, that Gorbachev announced unilaterally, without asking for any kind of concession from the United States or NATO. He basically announced that the Soviet Union would withdraw 50,000 of its troops from East Germany and would reduce the size of its armed forces by 500,000 persons. And again, the motivation was quite clearly economic. Having all those people, in the military was costly. They weren't then engaged in what could have been productive labor for other parts of the economy. So he basically made an economic decision, but he also was intent on furthering this whole process of easing relations with the United States and the West so that there would be what he hoped would be more opportunity to deal with the issues at home, both economic and otherwise, in terms of glasnost and perestroika. Now, for him, it didn't work out so well. That strategy did not work. But we won't get into that right now. And then also, this was in line with that. I bet a lot of you remember how Poland was very much in the news throughout the 80s, really, starting in 1980, when the Solidarity movement, which was a movement among Polish workers initially in the shipyards of Gdansk, basically, complaining about the poor living conditions, the poor wages, and demanding changes in the Polish economy. Initially, it was an economic movement, but it ultimately would evolve into a political movement critical of the communist government of Poland. And at different times, even Gorbachev, when resistance in Poland to the Polish government was becoming more and more intense, as the Soviet Union had done many times since the 50s, whether it was in Hungary in 56 or in Czechoslovakia in 68, or actually even earlier in East Germany in 1953, the Soviet government did not want to see the collapse of one of its Eastern European allies. And so the Soviets basically were holding out the threat of military intervention in Poland if that became necessary to prevent an insurrectionary movement against the communist government. That's all, from the early 80s before Gorbachev was in power, up through the mid-1980s. But by 1988, especially as Gorbachev is trumpeting the idea of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, and he's introduced in the Soviet Union a very limited form of electoral democracy, not so much one person, one vote, but even at least within the Communist Party, allowing kind of freer and fairer elections in a way that was sort of opening up the political system. And people in Poland in particular who had been with the Solidarity movement trying to move in that direction, if not even further, for almost a decade, they became an even greater threat to the Polish government. And Gorbachev finally announced in 1988 that it wasn't going to be the role of the Soviet Union to try to intervene to back up a Polish government if it couldn't maintain the support of its own people. And you know what happened soon thereafter. This is just after Reagan left office, that ultimately the Polish government fell. There were free elections, and the whole tide of expulsion of communist governments spread throughout Eastern Europe. That was really after Reagan left office. But again, even in 1988, Gorbachev had already basically announced that he was renouncing what had been known as the Brezhnev doctrine, that the Soviets would have the right to assist friendly governments within, he didn't say within the Soviet orb, but what he meant basically, Brezhnev, was that the Russians had the right to support governments which were allied to it. And Gorbachev basically said, I'm renouncing the Brezhnev doctrine. If a local government can't maintain support, we're not going to go in either militarily or otherwise to bail them out. So, in looking at what was clearly a dramatically different situation by the end of 1988, just as Reagan was about to leave office, I'd emphasize again that it is possible that if somebody else had been president, like if Caspar Weinberger had been president instead of Ronald Reagan, the chances of these agreements taking place or the easing of tensions, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. It did require, somebody who was going to be willing to respond to the possibilities that Gorbachev's coming to power presented. And so I think in that sense, Reagan deserves credit. Reagan was motivated, substantially, I think, by his quite sincere abhorrence of the idea of nuclear war, and his whole approach to moving toward arms control And then when that was moving apace, seeing that this was a different Soviet Union and being responsive to that was extremely important in that sense. Which is not to say, and this is where I would ask this question before about whether I think the U.S. military buildup and trying to spin the Russians into bankruptcy was the compelling factor, and that or providing the weaponry to the Afghan rebels was the deciding factor in basically contributing to the U.S. quote winning the Cold War. I think can be exaggerated. I think it's more that Gorbachev was responding to longer-term problems in the Soviet Union, but that doesn't mean that Reagan doesn't deserve any credit for the flexibility he ultimately showed. And ultimately, in terms of Gorbachev, I think his primary motivation was recognizing that without an easing of tensions and the ability to restrain the military side of expenditures in the Soviet Union, he was never going to be able to get the Soviet economy going in a productive way. And so ultimately, his domestic concerns, had a tremendous influence on his approach to foreign policy. And with that, I'm early, but comments or questions about? Yes.
We hear a lot about Reagan's diminished mental powers at the end of his term. Was he actually the one making these decisions? You said it wasn't Weinberger, but is there somebody else behind him that was pointing him where to go?
Well, he had the question was, we know, after the fact that certainly later on, Reagan did develop Alzheimer's, and there's, some question about, when the effects of diminished capacity, began to play out, and whether he was really, in control of his foreign policy, or whether it was really other people in his administration who were making the decisions. I think you could see that his commitment to SDI was totally his own. In fact, I've read one account that Weinberger and I'll call them the hawks in the administration, they didn't really necessarily think that SDI could work, but they were happy to see Reagan adamant about it because they thought of it as an obstacle to arms control agreements. But so Reagan was making his own decisions about that, and the responsiveness, in some sense, the INF treaty was because then Gorbachev said, well, okay, we'll go to what you yourself had proposed earlier on, this 0-0 option for intermediate range forces. Reagan, from what I have now read, much more than when we were seeing the Reagan presidency live, reading, from whether it wasn't necessarily connected to Alzheimer's, but he was somebody who, for quite a long time, had the habit of either taking a nap in the afternoon or not. He was much better early in the day than he was later in the day, so that there were some issues about his energy level, and there was also, I'll get to you in just a second, Emily. There were also questions about his command of detail about a lot of things. So there were issues about him, but I think in terms of the broad outlines, he had an administration which was quite seriously divided internally. I mentioned Weinberger. Weinberger wasn't the only person, but on the other hand, he had George Shultz, who was very supportive of this new relationship with the Soviet Union and the desirability of arms control. So ultimately, he had to choose. And I think some people, to what extent Nancy Reagan also was a factor, Nancy in the second term in particular, being concerned about how history was going to look at her husband, she was a voice in support of this, this new dealings with the new dealings with the Soviet Union. So that obviously had some importance because she was the closest person to him. Everything I read about him is that in terms of personal relationships, he had obviously a very close relationship to Nancy, but with everybody else, he actually, we know he didn't have a close relationship with his children, but he didn't have a very close personal relationship with most other people. And so the fact that Nancy was a voice in favor of this direction was important. But ultimately, I mean, he did make these decisions. Emily, you had a comment or a question?
My brother was invited to a luncheon at the White House for newsmen from small radio stations. He sat at the same luncheon table with the president. And he said that the president definitely was not all there, and that his chief of staff was in charge, at least from what my brother could see. That would have been in '87.
Yeah. And as I said, from what I've read, there were different times of the day when he was much better than others. Even lunch, but yeah. Tom? The question, if you couldn't hear, was did Bush Sr. have much of a role in Reagan's foreign policy? And you know, the accounts I've been reading don't really mention him a lot. But I think he was sitting in on National Security Council meetings and was certainly aware of what was going on. But I don't, in terms of the split within the administration, what I'd read focuses on more the cabinet and sub-cabinet people rather than on Bush. He wasn't a non-entity, but I don't think he was a central player.
One of the things that this is a very small thing that relates to what you were saying about Gorbachev and his background. I remember in the 2000s that he was making commercials for his own luggage. And I have two questions. Did he go back to did he live in the Soviet Union or in Paris? I mean,
He lives in Moscow. The question was about, what happened to Gorbachev afterwards. And he lives in Moscow, he's 86, I think, now. And I was saying during the break to Donna that it's sort of surprising because he's not really liked in Russia. and he's so well liked in the West, why he would want to be living in Moscow.
and my other question is, what percentage now do we spend on the military? You said when the Soviets were
Yeah, it was 6 then.
It was 6 then. What is it now?
Okay, let's see. Well, it's definitely less, and considerably less. The question was, if I said we spent 6% of GDP on the military in the 1970s, what percentage of the GDP goes to the military now? And let's see, the military budget is what? I forgot, I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like in the neighborhood of 750 billion, I think.
It's actually a little less than that.
Okay, so let's say if it were 700 billion and the GDP is 14, 15 trillion, so that's less than 150, 1/20th, so, well, that would be maybe 4%.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So, but it is less than we spent back in the 70s. But it's still, the arguments that Trump is having with our NATO allies, the NATO allies had, made a commitment at some point, not necessarily today, but at some point to spend up to 2% of GDP on defense. And the United States is spending definitely more than that. So if 4 would give you an idea. So it's not like hugely less, but it is less. Because also the number of people, well, I don't know, I'm sure the cost of the military compared, before when there was a draft, before there was, quote, a professional army, where you'd have to pay people somewhat more to entice them to join the military, the human costs, I'm sure, probably are a higher proportion now, although the size of the military is lower than it was in the 70s.
3.5.
3.5. Okay. Thank you. The wonders of modern technology.
How easy would it have been to cheat
Yeah, well, I think some people do. But actually, that's pretty good. I'm pretty proud of myself that I came up with 4. That's not bad, huh? I shouldn't brag. Yeah.
I have a question about Gorbachev and Putin. It seems to me that Putin, who was in East Germany at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, apparently not happy with that development. My question is, to what extent did Gorbachev's policies in reducing military spending, et cetera, influence Putin to go quickly in the opposite direction?
Well, could you hear that question? Okay. The question had to do with that Putin was in East Germany, when Gorbachev was starting to lower military spending, reduce the military footprint of the Soviet Union, and to what extent has that, influenced Putin's, moving in exactly the opposite direction of putting a lot more emphasis on the military. And, well, clearly, Putin has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the most tragic event of the 20th century, and he certainly, rused the day that the then Soviet Union or Russia lost its. He wouldn't call it an empire in Eastern Europe, but its privileged position, shall we say, in Eastern Europe. So he's certainly reacting to that. I was reading, when I was asked, about where Gorbachev was living, I just had been looking up something about Gorbachev just earlier today, and Gorbachev actually supported Putin when Putin first was appointed by Yeltsin to become, president. I think he regrets that. He's now critical of him. Yeah, well, Yeltsin didn't last too long. So, but yeah, certainly Putin is reacting negatively to the whole course of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the limiting of Soviet or Russian influence in the world.
So the trust and verify idea mentioned, so then I assume that both sides were using verification. Let's start with the INF when they went to 0-0. How did that work? Was it thorough? Was it careful? I mean, what happened to the, and then did that continue in the same way with the SALT?
Okay, the SALT, as opposed to START.
Whichever one came after.
Okay, well, I'll go back, a quick history, the SALT treaties, the first treaty, SALT I is 1972, and then SALT II, which wasn't ratified, but so I'll just talk about SALT I. The way that each side was supposed to be able to check on the other, there was no on-site verification, but they relied on satellites. And they said, most of the people in the Pentagon were satisfied that the satellites provided, I say most, not everybody, provided adequate verification of living up to the SALT I agreements. After the INF treaty introduced the on-site verification, the subsequent START treaty, which called for further destruction of nuclear weapons or decommissioning of nuclear weapons, did include on-site verification, which is quite intrusive. In fact, it's interesting that one of there were members of the Pentagon when the first INF treaty was talking about actually going back to, or the first draft of an INF treaty included actually having on-site inspectors going to the factories where these missiles were produced, because it didn't necessarily assume that there would be no more built. And the Pentagon said, we don't want that. We don't want Russian spies being able to see our production techniques by being on site. It's a different thing to have them on site to watch a weapon being decommissioned or destroyed. That's okay, but not in the factory. But the subsequent START treaties do have on-site verification of the decommissioning or destruction of nuclear weapons. Frank, you know more about this stuff than I do. I think.
Another way they verify these types of things, for example, with aircraft, is they will set the aircraft out in the desert, they will chop the wings off of it, lay it out on the ground next to it, and then it can always be verified by satellite that that aircraft is no longer functional. That's the simple one there. When you're talking about silos, it gets to be a little more complicated, but generally they'll go to the actual site of the silo and see that the silo has been physically destroyed, so that they actually do go on site. And then as far as the warheads themselves, those can be verified usually in a very enclosed environment, let's put it that way, because you are dealing with plutonium, for example. So it's pretty cut and dry. You can cheat on some things, but you can't cheat on all of them.
I guess trying to think about the spirit of this whole thing, was each side relatively well satisfied with the other's adherence to the principle?
We're not. We have, to this date, have issues with the current Russian regime in regards to their living up to all the details of their issues as far as getting rid of things. They continuously delay. I personally don't see that as a huge issue, but it's always brought up that they aren't, following it to the letter. But again, I don't see that as being a huge problem, personally.
And then I should also mention, about the ABM treaty, which would have put limits on any development of SDI. And again, SDI was a space-based defense system. I mean, we have other systems like the Patriot. I don't know, I'm no military expert, but the kind of system which, say, has been deployed in Israel to shoot down, these are not intercontinental ballistic missiles that occasionally have been sent into Israeli territory. There's a Patriot system which can shoot down basically lower flying, shorter range missiles. Slower. So that's not covered by the ABM treaty. But there were disputes, with the Russians complaining about whether any kind of testing for anti-ballistic missile systems, whether the U.S. was fully in compliance. And then when George W. Bush became president, George W. Bush formally renounced the ABM treaty.
That's why we have that, for example, among other things that are not particularly spoken about. Nuclear area defense.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, well, we're exactly 10 after. But I'm thinking for next time, I don't have like I'll make some initial remarks, but I thought we could have much more discussion, not just questions to me, but we could have more discussion about what we see as the legacy of Reagan, and maybe we can come back to pursuing comparisons between then and now.